Hey everyone, welcome back. Originally, we were actually planning to make this episode about AI ethics, like privacy, surveillance, all those heavy topics people usually talk about when AI comes up. But then something kind of shifted while we were researching.
Yeah, we kept getting distracted by something way more interesting.
Exactly. I kept seeing videos from China where people were using voice messages everywhere. Like literally walking down the street, talking to their phones, talking to AI assistants, sending voice chats in public like it was the most natural thing ever. And honestly, my first reaction was, wait, people are okay with that? Because in Korea, even taking a phone call on the subway can feel awkward.
Right. So at first it feels like a privacy issue, like maybe people just cared less about privacy.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. But then I started reading more about it and realized the story is actually much more complicated than that. Because suddenly you start asking, wait, maybe UX isn't universal at all. Maybe culture changes what feels natural, comfortable, or even usable.
What surprised me is that there's actually a very practical reason voice interfaces became so common in China. Chinese typing is genuinely more complicated than most alphabet-based languages.
Yeah, because you're not directly typing characters the way we type English or Korean.
Exactly. You type pinyin first, then choose characters from prediction candidates. And if the sentence gets longer, the interaction itself becomes more cognitively demanding.
So speaking can actually become the more efficient interface.
Right. Especially on mobile. And once voice recognition becomes good enough, people naturally start switching to the lower friction input method.
That's really interesting because we usually think of voice UX as this futuristic optional feature, but in that context, it almost becomes the default interaction.
Exactly. And I think this is important because it shows that input methods are not neutral. Language structure itself can shape UX behavior.
But even with that explanation, I still don't think people in Korea would suddenly start talking to AI in public tomorrow.
Same. Because technology alone doesn't determine behavior. Social comfort matters too.
Yeah. Korea and Japan especially have strong public silence cultures. Even in cafes or elevators, people naturally lower their voices.
Which means voice UX immediately runs into a social barrier. Not because the technology fails, but because the behavior itself feels uncomfortable in public.
That's such an interesting way to think about UX, because something can technically work perfectly and still fail socially.
Exactly. A feature is only successful if people feel comfortable using it around other humans.
Meanwhile, in China, public speech feels much more normalized, so voice interaction becomes socially usable, not just technically usable.
Yeah. Which makes me think maybe the final barrier of UX isn't technology, it's social pressure. Or honestly, social awkwardness.
That sounds funny, but it actually explains so many products. This conversation started reminding me of QR ordering systems too, because China feels incredibly optimized around QR interactions, menus, ordering, payment. Everything flows through your phone.
And what's interesting is people don't really interpret that as bad service. It's just considered efficient,
Yeah, in some restaurants, you barely interact with staff at all. And honestly, people seem completely fine with it.
which makes sense in an environment that values speed and high turnover. Efficiency itself becomes part of the service experience.
Korea feels somewhat similar too. Now, when I walk into a cafe and see a kiosk or table order system, I don't even question it anymore. Sometimes I actually prefer it.
Same. Because sometimes talking to someone feels like the slower interaction. The interface becomes the smoother social experience.
But when I think about the US, it still feels really different there.
Yeah, because in a lot of Western environments, interaction itself is part of the product.
I remember going to cafes in the US and realizing people actually spend time talking to baristas, not just ordering, actual conversation.
Right. And people don't seem to treat that interaction as inefficiency. It's part of the atmosphere.
Exactly. In Korea, the ideal experience is often, let me finish this interaction quickly and smoothly. But in the US, sometimes the interaction itself is the experience.
Which means removing human interaction entirely can sometimes make the experience feel emotionally empty instead of efficient.
That's so interesting because if you only measure UX through efficiency metrics, QR ordering looks objectively better, but emotionally, maybe it isn't always. I think Starbucks shows this difference really clearly. In Korea, mobile ordering feels almost like the default now. You order before arriving, grab your drink, and leave immediately.
Yeah, Korean users really value removing uncertainty from the process. No waiting awkwardly. No repeating your order. No unnecessary interaction.
Exactly. But when I visited the US, Starbucks felt way more conversational. The barista would ask little questions, call your name differently, make casual comments. And people actually engaged with it.
Right. And what's interesting is that interaction isn't treated like wasted time. It's part of what makes the place feel welcoming.
At first I thought, wow, this is less efficient. But then I realized maybe efficiency wasn't the main goal there in the first place.
I think UX culture often teaches us that friction is always bad. Reduce clicks, reduce time, reduce interaction.
Yeah, like the ultimate goal is making humans disappear from the process entirely.
Exactly. But maybe some forms of friction actually create emotional value.
That really changed my perspective, honestly, because technically talking to a barista is inefficient, but emotionally, it can make a place feel human.
Right. Some interactions create warmth, trust, memory, connection. Not every interaction is just a barrier to remove.
Which means a completely frictionless UX isn't automatically the best UX. That's such a weirdly important realization. And this feels even more important now because AI is pushing everything toward automation.
Yeah. AI naturally optimizes toward less effort, less waiting, less interaction.
Which sounds amazing until you realize something disappears too.
Exactly. If everything becomes frictionless, human interaction itself may become rare. And once something becomes rare, it often becomes valuable.
That's honestly kind of fascinating. In the future, maybe talking to a real human becomes a premium experience.
I can totally see that happening. A fully automated cafe becomes normal. And then suddenly the cafe with real conversations becomes the luxury experience.
I think the biggest thing I realized today is that good UX isn't universal. What feels intuitive in one culture can feel uncomfortable in another.
Because UX isn't only about interfaces, it's also about language, social behavior, cultural expectations, and what people emotionally value.
And maybe not all friction is bad. Sometimes friction is where human connection exists.
So now we want to ask you guys something. Would you rather have the fastest possible service or a service that still feels human?
And what's a UX difference you noticed while traveling or living in another culture? We'd love to hear your experiences.
See you next time.